let me see if I can share. Is it sharing my screen?
I see you, but not.
No, you already shared before, so now you unshared your screen. You should go back.
Now, let's see now.
Just a minute, we have to wait because it needs some time. Not yet.
I'll do it again, let's see. Now it's doing something.
Now it's okay.
Now it's okay?
Yes.
Okay. So let me put it in full screen. Okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. I'm really happy to meet you, at least virtually. I hope next time you will be in Italy. And say hello to everybody and tell you about some of the last things I've been working on. What I want to tell you about today is about the dynamics of a classical integrable non-trivial model that most of you know already, but with a little twist that makes it interesting from the classical mechanics point of view, and how its long-term dynamics can be described with a generalized Gibbs ensemble formalism that people have used until now mostly to describe the behavior of quantum systems out of equilibrium. And actually, our aim in this study was to show that very similar questions and very similar answers are found if one looks at the dynamics of classical isolated problems that evolve out of equilibrium. So what's the original motivation for asking these kind of questions? Sort of 15 years ago, there was a revival of asking questions about the equilibration of isolated closed systems that came from the field of cold atom experiments. There has been an enormous amount of work devoted to the study of these systems, which can be controlled in the lab with different kinds of techniques that I'm not going to explain. I don't really know in detail so as to explain that. But anyhow, what these people managed to do is to isolate, for example, systems of bosons and confine them in finite dimensional spaces that could be lattices or could be, continuous spaces, and then see how the systems evolve after they quench them somehow by, for example, changing the interactions between the atoms and things like that, or changing the confining potential, or changing the lattice spacing. They do many different kinds of experiments of this kind. And sort of simultaneously with the big developments of experimental techniques to keep these systems isolated and follow them in real time, especially Pasquale Calabrese with John Cardy in Oxford, they developed conformal field theory methods to study the same kind of quantum quenches in low-dimensional systems. So low-dimensional field theories or even lattice field theories and things like this. So they succeeded in obtaining exact results for certain quenches, and this opened the way to a large number of theoretical studies in this field as well. And on the other hand, there were lots of numerical studies of people who do ab initio sort of evolution dynamics of the same kind of systems. And okay, I just cite a group who had a very important impact in the field by proposing to use these generalized Gibbs ensembles. Indeed, when they were studying problems of bosons moving in one-dimensional or higher dimensional lattices, mostly one-dimensional systems that were studying with their numerical techniques. But okay, this was just the start of this field. So there were both, experimental, numerical, and analytical results that around 15 years ago have launched this new interest in looking at the evolution of closed quantum systems. So the questions that these people were asking were of the kind, does an isolated quantum system reach some kind of equilibrium? In which cases, and for which kind of interactions between these elementary bosons, let's say, in the system, the Boltzmann density matrix is attained in some long-term limit or not, or what else happens in the long-term limit. And as I said, this was boosted by recent interest in the quantum quenches of cold atoms. But not only that, there's also the big field of many-body localization that asks similar questions. But we can say, well, okay, fantastic. I mean, you have all these experiments and numerical techniques applied to, and analytical techniques as well, applied to quantum systems. But indeed, one could ask the same kind of questions for a classical isolated model. And in a sense, this is the old godicity question revisited. When and how does a classical closed system reach normal thermal distributions or some other kind of distribution, or does it behave dynamically in a non-trivial way forever? What's going on here? So the kind of results that we have derived recently concerning these kind of questions have been in collaboration with Damien Barbier, who's my PhD student in Paris, Gustavo Lozano and Nicolas Nessi from Buenos Aires, and then Marco Pico and his former PhD student, Alessandro Tartaglia, who's now in Milano, on the Parisian side, let's say, of the collaboration. So let me define a little bit more precisely what a quantum quench is, and then introduce the classical analog to it. So what these people ask is, imagine that you take an isolated quantum system, which is characterized by a Hamiltonian H0, which I signal here. There is a hat because it's an operator. And let's say that you initialize the system in, for example, the ground state, psi naught of this Hamiltonian H0. You could also take other mixed initial states, but just to make it simple, in general, quite in general, they use ground state wave functions or states. And then they evolve this ground state with unitary time evolution, so the system is isolated with a unitary evolution operator you had, but which is given by a different Hamiltonian from the one with which they prepare the system initially. So H hat is different from H hat naught. And then they ask, okay, under this evolution, what happens? Does the system reach, at least locally, some steady state in a large volume limit? If so, is it described by a thermal equilibrium density matrix of the kind e to the minus beta h hat with a new h hat and some beta to be determined? Or maybe not, but perhaps some local observables behave as thermal ones, and I will precise what I mean by observables behaving as thermal ones in a second. Or you could also ask, well, is the time evolution as the one that you could expect in this kind of equilibrium? Or maybe not. Maybe there's other density matrices different from this one that will describe the stationary regime, if the stationary regime exists. So this is the kind of issues that people have addressed since like 15 years ago in the quantum realm. But now you can ask the same question for a classical system, because you can take an isolated classical system with a Hamiltonian H0, and there's no hat because it's a Hamiltonian of classical variables, and then evolve it, then evolve it with a different, evolve the system with a different Hamiltonian H. So more precisely, let's say that you take initial configurations which are drawn, for example, from a probability distribution of Boltzmann kind, for example, but it could be something else, but that this distribution knows about the initial Hamiltonian H0, and say that if it's Boltzmann-like, it's characterized by an inverse temperature beta naught. But then you evolve those initial conditions drawn in this way with a different Hamiltonian, and we ask the same sort of questions. So does the system reach a steady state? Is it a thermal one or not? How do some observables local in space behave? And so on and so forth. So the same kind of questions as the quantum ones, and these are very well posed questions, and you can try to see, how different systems behave with respect to these questions. So concerning observables, now let's stick to the classical language and say that, okay, imagine that the system reached a steady state in the large volume limit or large number of variables, degrees of freedom limit. So you can, for example, for an observable O, go and compute a time average of that observable after some characteristic time scale, let's say this steady state time scale, which is very difficult to know, but okay, let's imagine that it exists, and that then you can average these observables over time windows, which are sufficiently large to get some time average of the observable of your choice. And then you want to compare that time evolution or time average evolution, better said, a time average result of the observable with some statistical average. So you want to do a statistical average with a measure, rho, that you don't know a priori, and you want to know whether for some measure this time-dependent or time average equals the statistical average that you construct. So for which rho you can, oops, I'm moving this. You can equate these two quantities. So there's a very nice paper by Emil, I will call him by his first name because his surname is too difficult to pronounce, from 2018, where he argued that for a classical problem, which is isolated from the environment, there exists a generalized microcanonical measure that does this job, that it shows that these two objects should be equal. But then you can ask, okay, fine, for a classical system, I'm sure that we'll have this microcanonical measure now. What happens with the extension to a canonical measure? Say that I want to look at observables which are defined in some local region of space. So this is what I mean by local observables. And then I want to know whether, as in usual statistical mechanics, can I characterize them by a canonical average with some canonical measure, which I still don't know. So if yes, which one it is, and how can I write it, and how can I compute those averages? So these are the kind of questions that one can ask in the classical realm. So our strategy to deal with this problem was to choose a sufficiently simple, still interacting, this is the word that is used in the quantum field. So a classical problem, which is not just harmonic oscillators, this is what I mean, that will be integrable, and I will precise what I mean by integral in a second. Integrable, and why an integrable problem? Because for a non-integrable problem, I would expect that, unless there are glassy features, which I don't want to discuss, a non-integrable problem, sufficiently interacting and so on, will reach a Boltzmann distribution measure. So I want to consider cases which are not within the usual statistical physics class, let's say. So for this reason, I want to consider an integrable, though non-trivial, classical problem. One, if possible, with an interesting phase diagram in normal equilibrium, so that I could draw, as I suggested at the beginning, initial conditions in different phases, and such that as well I could take the system across the phase transitions in this phase diagram with the quenches and see how, conditions prepared in one phase evolve when I put the system in the other phase, and issues of this kind. Why do I do this? Okay, because I want to have richness in the possibilities of, what the dynamics of my system will do, and not just consider the simplest possible cases. So the good news is that such a model exists, and the people who have worked on these other systems know it already. With a very simple modification, we can make it integrable, and we can make it solvable in all senses, as I will show you, and one can then address the questions that I have already posed and give them an answer. So after I have defined or recalled the definition of this problem and the equilibrium Boltzmann phase diagram, what I will do is I will detach it from the bath, let it evolve in isolation, solve the dynamics after quenches, later on build the generalized Gibbs ensemble, which is the extension of the canonical measure for integrable systems that two people have proposed, but I will define the classical version of it, and then prove by the end that the asymptotic dynamics of the local observables is indeed captured by the GG averages, which is interesting, not only because it proves that in a classical system, this same kind of mechanisms of describing long-term dynamics with generalized Gibbs ensembles applies, at least in this case, but also because in this problem, we can compute everything almost analytically. I mean, there's always some numerics in the end, but most of the treatment is analytical, is exact, and this is something that not always is possible in the quantum problems which are interactive. Okay, so what about the first part? Choose a sufficiently simple classical integral interacting model. So the model is our beloved spherical P equals 2 model of Kosterlitz, Hautes, and Jones. So it's a problem in which at the beginning it was posed as a spin glass problem, although it was soon realized that it was a bit too simple to be a spin glass. But still, I mean, it's a problem that comes from the field of spin glasses. And it's a problem in which what you do is you consider interactions between pairs of spins, which are these SIs here, mediated these interactions by coupling strengths, which are JIJs, which are symmetric, taken from a Gaussian probability distribution with zero mean and variance given by this expression here, which is normalized with the number of spins in such a way that the thermodynamic limit makes sense. And the difference with the complicated spin glass problems is that here the spin variables are real numbers. So they can vary from minus infinity to infinity, apart from the fact that they are spherically globally constrained in such a way that the sum over all these spins squared should be equal to the number of spins in the sample. So this is the spherical constraint that in this version of the generalized potential that I'm introducing is imposed with a Lagrange multiplier, which I call Z, and that is added to the original potential energy, which is this one over here. So this is a statistical physics problem to start with. There's no classical mechanics here for the moment, but it will appear a bit later in my presentation. So for the moment, this classical statistical physics, which I'm doing. Classical in the sense of standard. Now, these JIJs here, which couple all the spins, so there's a fully connected matrix of couplings here. Because it's taken from the Gaussian, because the elements of this matrix are Gaussian distributed and it's normalized in this way, the eigenvalues of this matrix Jij are distributed according to the Wigner semicircle law, which I recall here. And this is not completely necessary in what I'm going to tell you next, but it's convenient to do analytical calculations. But the only thing you need, to extend what I'm going to say you later on, is that the distribution of eigenvalues of the coupling matrix should be bounded, and that there shouldn't be degeneracies of eigenvalues, so that the eigenvalues should be different. There should be repulsion of eigenlevels, as is usually said in the context of random matrices. So this is ensured by this kind of distribution function of the JIJs. So now the generalized potential, which I have written, with the box above, can be diagonalized. If you go to the basis of eigenvectors of the Jij matrix, and you call lambda mu, as I have already done here, the eigenvalues of those matrices, then, well, it's trivial to write this expression here, where S mu is the projection of the vector S that I can construct by setting in each coordinate one of these SIs in the direction of the corresponding eigenvector. So this effective potential, which appears here, is quadratic in S mu squared, is decoupled in S mu squared, but this is not completely true, what I'm saying, because of the Lagrange multiplier, which should enforce the spherical constraint, and that it has to be fixed to do it, and by fixing Z to enforce this spherical constraint, Z actually becomes a function of the S's themselves. So this is almost a quadratic function of the S mu's, but indeed it is not. And this makes the problem interacting, this is what I mean by interacting, and not completely trivial. It's not just harmonic oscillators which are decoupled one from the other one. They are coupled through this Z here. Okay, so Kosterlitz, Hautes, and Jones studied the Boltzmann equilibrium of this problem. So they computed the partition function of the problem. So here we are imagining that your system is in contact with the bath. The bath has an inverse temperature beta. And by just doing some simple Gaussian integrals, you can realize that the equilibrium expectation value in Boltzmann distribution of the S mu squared each of these projections of the vector on the eigenvectors, is given by a simple expression, which is a function of z, the Lagrange multiplier, and the corresponding eigenvalue, and that the z has to be fixed by the spherical constraint. So what Kostelis, and Jones did is to say, okay, let me fix this spherical constraint on average. So sum over mu the averages of the S mu squares, and I require that it's equal to n. Take the large n limits, and this gives an integral equation that fixes the value of z. And what they realize is that there is a phase transition dictated by when the behavior of the z as a function of the control parameters, which are temperature and interaction strength, changes behavior. So above a critical temperature is a function z of t and j squared and so on, and below the critical temperature it gets fixed to a value which is identical to the largest eigenvalue of the Wigner semicircle law. So the largest eigenvalue of the interaction matrix. Not only that, okay, z, you say it's a strange quantity, so okay, it changes behavior. What does that mean? So more physically, what it means is that below the critical temperature, the projection of the vector spin on the direction of the eigenvector that corresponds to the largest eigenvalue becomes a massless quantity. So this means that in the limit of n going to infinity, the difference between this largest eigenvalue and z goes to 0. And this is accompanied by the fact that the expectation value of Sn squared, again, the projection of, this is what the Sn I'm talking about here, in equilibrium is proportional to n. So there is a condensation phenomenon of this expectation value of Sn squared, which becomes macroscopic. And this is very similar to Gaussian-Einstein condensation, and this feature was already discussed by Kostelis and company in their original paper. So the transition corresponds to a extended condensed phase transition in the sense that above the critical temperature, the projection of all modes are order 1, while below the critical temperature, there is this condensation phenomenon. There are other issues that are related to how this Sn squared value order n can be attained. There are actually two possibilities. It's either with distribution functions of the Sn that are Gaussian and large, very wide, with a wide sigma squared, if you wish. And there is the other possibility, which is more like symmetry breaking sort of behavior, where indeed the spin is directed and doesn't fluctuate in the direction of this preferred direction of the Jij's eigenvectors. This has been already discussed in the context of a similar model in the 70s by Katz, and very recently it was rediscussed in the context of the relations with the Bose-Einstein condensation by Marco Zanetti and collaborators. Okay, so this is the equilibrium usual statistical physics analysis of this problem. Now, how do I go to classical mechanics? How do I introduce Newton evolution of this problem, which at the beginning were spins? So I introduced this vector S, which is formed by putting all the SIs in row in a vector with n components. And there is this global constraint. So what this means is that this vector S is constrained to move on a sphere of radius square root of n. Now, if I now interpret the problem as the problem of a particle, which has position vector S on the sphere and moves with kinetic energy of the usual kind, now I have the problem of a particle moving on a Sn-1 sphere, if you wish. And I can also impose on this problem the spherical constraint by introducing a Lagrange multiplier that will be a function of the position and the momentum of the particle. Okay, so S and P are vectors with n components, and they are orthogonal because of the constraint on the sphericity of the space on which the particle can move. And okay, I have Newton or Hamilton equations, if you wish, for the position, the velocity related to the momentum, and the equation of motion of my particle. So the again, the potential looks quadratic because of the quadratic interactions between the spins, but it's not because of the z, which is a function of the S and the P. So actually it's a quartic. If one looks at the form of the Z, it's a quartic kind of potential, effective potential that acts on the particle. Now, what is the role played by this largest eigenvalue in the distribution of the eigenvalues of the interaction matrix? Well, what happens is that it corresponds, this value here, the edge of the Wigner semicircle law, to the minimum of the potential energy landscape that I have generalized to include the Lagrange multiplier here. So this is the minimum, this is the maximum of this potential energy landscape, and the potential energy has saddles all along this space between the minimum and the maximum that can be characterized indeed. But just bear in mind that this edge corresponds to the minimum of the potential where the vector S points in the direction of the eigenvector corresponding to this eigenvalue. Now, okay, now I have the problem of a particle moving on a sphere. And indeed, this problem was studied by Neumann in the mid-18th as a problem of classical mechanics. And it's a problem that already Neumann knew that it was integrable. So what does it mean? It means that there are n, the same number of degrees of freedom in the problem, constants of motion, which are in involution, so the Poisson brackets of two different mu's, these constants of motion is equal to 0. And the constants of motion were known for small values of n by Neumann already, but then Uhlenbeck gave a generalized expression for these constants of motion, which are actually modified angular momentum forms. So why modified? Because of the harmonic potentials that act in the directions of in different directions of in the n-dimensional space. So it's anisotropic harmonic potentials acting on this particle, and the particle moves on the sphere, and it's not difficult to show that these objects are conserved by the Newton dynamics. So again, the notation is such that this mu is the projection of the vector on the eigenvectors, and p mu the same. And there are two constraints that these n constants of motion satisfy. One is that the sum over all of them is equal to n, and the other one is that the Hamiltonian, the total energy as kinetic energy plus potential energy of the problem, is written as a sum over lambda mu's, the eigenvalues of the J matrix, times the I mu's. So there have been several studies of this problem for finite n in the 90s, but of course people who were interested in integrable systems, they were not interested in the n going to infinity limit of this problem. This is something that is of interest to us now because we want to try to say something about possible equilibrations of this problem, and this can only occur if one takes a large n limit at the beginning of your calculation. So what we want to know now is how this system evolves when n goes to infinity. How does it evolve in time? Whether we can characterize its evolution in time, eventually compute time averages at long time limits, and then compare to what possibly will be a generalized Gibbs ensemble for this problem, that since we know the I mu's, we can construct. So how do we construct it? How does everybody construct these GGEs? Well, by extending the e to the minus beta h of Boltzmann to include all the constants of motion in the exponential with Lagrange multipliers, let's say, gamma mu's that have to be fixed somehow. And I will tell you how to fix them later on. So now I want to do dynamics of this problem. So how do I do it? First thing I have to do is to choose initial conditions. So I made all this discussion about the Boltzmann equilibrium properties of the spherical spin glass because I wanted to use initial conditions drawn from this kind of distributions. Why so? Again, because I know there are two phases and then initial conditions with different characteristics that I can exploit and then to see how they evolve in time. So we choose the initial states from the GB canonical equilibrium. This means that basically there are two cases which are to be considered. A low temperature of the bath with which the system is set in contact before the evolution, such that there is condensation on the direction of the eigenvector associated to the largest eigenvalue, this Vn, and Sn squared average in the initial condition is over n. And then there's another case which is also interesting, which is to consider high temperature initial conditions. Sorry. Which is, sorry, it's on my second time, which are extended, we call them extended, such that this Sn squared is order 1. Okay, so these are typical initial conditions of the two phases of the Equilibrium-Boltzmann behavior of the problem. But now, okay, we do dynamics. So at the instant t equals 0, we decouple the system from this bath with which we prepare the initial conditions. And not only that, we change the Hamiltonian. So how do we change the Hamiltonian? By doing a rescaling of all the coupling strengths, Ji, J naught, the initial ones, and we call them Jij by multiplying each of the initial ones by a factor, let's say, scaling factor J over J naught. So the reason why we do this is because we want to keep some memory of the initial conditions. If we were changing, dramatically the Jij's completely, then the initial states, I mean, the evolution will know nothing about the initial conditions, and it will be a bit too drastic as a change. So by doing this, we can extract energy into the system, but not do a complete re-scrambling of the Hamiltonian and changing it completely. So the rescaling of the coupling strengths by this factor here is equivalent to saying that the eigenvalues of the matrix lambda naught go into lambda, which are also multiplied by the same factor. The quench is instantaneous, so the configuration doesn't change from time 0 minus to time 0 plus. It's sufficiently fast so that it doesn't change, neither position nor momentum of the particle. But there is an energy change because of the change in parameters. And the energy change is not difficult to see. It's positive for J over J naught negative, smaller than 1, and it's negative for J over J naught larger than 1. In one case, there is injection of energy, and the other one, there is extraction of energy. So now we have control, or we have identified the control parameters in this problem. One is the T naught over J naught, which controls which kind of initial conditions we use. So extended is above, condensed is below. And I changed, sorry, I forgot to change my color code. So I was using blue for condensed and red for extended, but I forgot to change it in this slide. And the other one has to do with which is the energy change done during the quench. Either you inject or you extract energy, depending on J over J naught being smaller or larger than 1. So there are two clear lines here, which is this one here, where you don't do anything on the system. So we just evolve with Newton dynamics an equilibrium initial state, equilibrium a la Boltzmann, and those initial conditions will, in the end, still be described by distributions of equilibrium a la Boltzmann along this vertical line, but not away from this vertical line. And this horizontal dashed line corresponds to the critical change between the initial conditions of one kind and the other. Okay, so how to study the large dynamics of this problem? So now we use all the technology of this other systems literature, now applied to this slight modification, actually, of the what we call P equals 2 spherical model. So now we have conservative dynamics. This for the Schwinger-Dyson dynamic mean field theory equations that control the behavior of correlation functions and linear response. Only puts a second time derivative here, and the choice of initial conditions that we do from equilibrium at Boltzmann measure with the inverse temperature beta naught makes these terms appear and add to the Schwinger-Dyson equations. So this is done with the methods introduced by these people like many years ago. It needs some replica techniques, but it's not difficult to implement, and it doesn't change at all with respect to what was done before for relaxation dynamics. Now, for this particular problem, the kernels in the Schwinger-Dyson equation are particularly simple. They are just linear functions of the correlation with the initial condition, the linear response, which are defined on average over initial condition and on average over these other realizations. So we know everything. We know what we have to use for initial conditions which are disordered, extended, or initial conditions which are condensed. We have a closed set of coupled integral differential equations that can be solved numerically and also analytically at long times. And with those, we derive a first idea of, where are the critical lines in the phase diagram. So the critical lines are this diagonal and this horizontal line here that distinguish the different kinds of initial conditions. Basically, from those analyses, we saw three sectors distinguished by the value of the asymptotics of the Lagrange multiplier. Okay, you could say that one is a little bit unphysical, but it's intimately related to the asymptotic value of the susceptibility. So it changes along this diagonal from one form to another form. This is like Curie, this is like something else. And on top of that, the limit of the correlation with the initial condition is different from the orange region here, which is 0, so the initial condition is forgotten, while it's non-zero in this green sector over here. There is a memory of the initial condition. So this is what we knew from first analysis based on the study of the Schwinger-Dyson equations. If one looks a little bit more carefully and wants to check whether indeed these things approach stationary values, well, one can do a nicer analysis, see how they approach with oscillations and power laws. Well, this is just to show you that these things we looked at, there's nothing very special to say about them. So there are asymptotic values for the Lagrange multiplier, there's asymptotic values for this correlation with the initial state. So what one could say non-conserved, because they change in time, one-time observables converge to constants. So does the system reach stationary dynamics? Is it just the usual equilibrium Boltzmann measure at a different temperature which is reached, or is it something else? And to check that, well, what one can do is to look at the evolution in time of the two-time correlation functions, two-time linear response functions, or susceptibilities. By looking at them, one sees that indeed stationary limits are reached by these correlation functions and linear responses, but there is no fluctuation dissipation theorem with a single temperature in the long time limit. So there is no Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution for the asymptotic evolution of this problem in none of the three sectors that we have already identified. Okay, but you could tell me, okay, this is not very surprising because you told me that this model is integrable. So why should it reach Boltzmann equilibrium? Indeed, it doesn't. So can something else be said about the evolution of this problem? And the answer is yes. If you look at the evolution of the modes, the projection of the position vector on the eigenvectors of the matrix. And directly working on the modes, one doesn't do an average over the randomness. One works at fixed randomness. One still does an average over the initial conditions. And there are techniques which are linked to the analysis of parametric oscillators that can be applied to this problem in a similar way to what was done previously by Cardi and Sotiriadis for the quantum ON model. Okay, this is just something technical, but not particularly difficult. So these equations can be solved efficiently, and the evolution of the initial condition averages of the modes can be followed and can be computed. So by looking at those, one realizes that, okay, these three sectors that I have already described are recovered, but then one notices that here there is another sector that distinguishes from the one above. And the way in which they distinguish these two ones below from the ones above is in what happens with the projection on the eigenvector of the largest eigenvalue. So basically what happens is that in this sector that we call 3, Sn squared is order n, while Pn squared is order 1. Well, here both Sn squared and Pn squared averaged are order n. So here there is only position condensation, if you wish. Here there is position and momentum condensation in the sense that both are order n. On top of that, for all parameters, all quenches, and so on and so forth, or mu, the limit of n being much larger than 1 and times being sufficiently long, times averages of these mode averages reach constants. And I will show you those constants later on. So how does one interpret what the dynamics is doing in this problem? So basically, this is the sphere on which the particle is moving. In what we call sectors 1 and 2, so for initial conditions which were extended, the particle moves around, and there's nothing special about it. I mean, it can cover the full sphere and just moves around. If one computes the average of the position projected on the largest eigenvector and the velocity of the momentum in that same direction, they average to 0. So it's this red dot over here. Now, if one starts from an initial state which is in the direction of this particular eigenvector, and one extracts energy from the system, basically the particle will stay turning around this particular direction slowly, and it will not escape it, and it will be doing this kind of motion, which is green, sketched in green in this picture here. And the projections of Sn and Pn average will be constant, Sn, constant, either above, either on the top or on the bottom, depending on which initial condition you have chosen. And this can be computed. I will tell you how later on. And it's importantly enough is order square root of n to ensure the spherical constraint, and there it is. The momentum instead averages to 0. While in the violet situation, which is the one that corresponds to this region here, the system acquires a lot of momentum, and the projection on this plane of SNPN, what it's doing is an ellipse. So it's an ellipse with different axes, but both axes are order square root of n, and this motion is sketched here by this cylinder, let's say, of violet color. So we understand what the particle is doing in each of the cases of the different phases that we have in this phase diagram. Now, can we say something about this behavior with a statistical measure? I mean, is this putative generalized Gibbs ensemble measure that we can construct with the constants of motion as functions of the phase variables in the problem good to describe the averages of S mu squared and P mu squared in the long time run? So, as you will see, the answer to the question is yes, and it's very nice the way in which this is achieved, because, okay, as I said already, Uhlenbeck identified these constants of motion, which I have already written here again to recall. Now, what do? Well, we have to fix the gamma mu's, the values of gamma mu, that will be here as Lagrange multipliers in this effective new generalized Gibbs ensemble constructed with the I mu's. So we will fix them on average. This means that we will fix them such that the average over this GGE measure of the I mu's should be equal to the average of the I mu's on the distribution of initial conditions that we use. So, okay, with this procedure, we will be able to fix the gamma mu's, and we will be able, in principle, to answer whether the average of non-conserved quantities on the GGE equal the averages over time. Now, I want to make a comment here, which is that we are very lucky with this problem because we know all these constants of motion in a non-trivial, as I said, interacting integrable problem. This is not always the case in quantum integrable systems where people don't know all the constants of motion, and okay, there has been a lot of research on these subjects recently, and I don't want to talk about that. But okay, in principle here, hopefully we will have the full set of constants of motion that we need to construct this measure. So now, what do we know about these integrals of motion? We know these some rules, which I have already told you about at the beginning when I introduced them. We can express them in the large n limit just by taking the limit of n going to infinity and transforming the sum, which was here, with the 1 over n into an integral. And this is the principal part because remember that in the sum, these two eigenvalues in the denominator had to be different. Now, here we have the density of eigenvalues, and here we have the numerator that was in the expression. Now, for the Gibbs-Boltzmann drawn equilibrium initial conditions, we can compute the average of this object here on the initial condition, because we have to average this over the initial conditions, we have to average that over the initial conditions. This can be done. I mean, I just wrote the expression here, but we have analytical expressions for these integrals. Okay, they are not very illuminating, they're just functions of the parameters in the problem, but we know them. The main important difference or thing to be said about it is that the behavior of the IN, so the I where mu is equal to n, again, the index corresponding to the largest eigenvalue of the interaction matrix, is either extended in the sense that it's order 1 for initial conditions in the extended phase, or it scales with n for initial conditions in the condensed phase. And this, you see, this is a big constraint, because this object has to be conserved by the dynamics, and this order n has to be conserved by the dynamics. One cannot take the IN out of this order n value with the dynamics. It's fixed by the initial conditions. So this is a strong constraint on what can happen in the quench dynamics of condensed initial conditions. Okay, so now we know certain properties of the I mu's that I have just summarized. Now, what about the distribution of the GG? Can we compute it? Well, first of all, let's try to see if it scales with n in a reasonable manner. So in normal Boltzmann distribution, you have here minus beta, the Hamiltonian, and the Hamiltonian is the energy, which is extensive. So you have something here that scales with n. Here we have a sum of n things that will scale with n if the gamma mu's are order 1 and the I mu's are order 1, order n of them, and perhaps the last one is order n, but only 1, right? So we have to be sure that this thing scales with n and not with n squared, because it will be too much if it squares with n squared. This we can check, at least for the initial conditions that we have chosen, that these kind of sums will scale with n as they should. You can check it a posteriori. Another thing is that we should be able to go back to the Boltzmann distribution, the usual one, if we don't do any quench. So no quench is j equals to j naught. And indeed, if we choose these gamma mu's to be of this form, because of one of the sum rules of the constants of motion of Uhlenbeck, we recover the Hamiltonian here, and then we get e to the minus beta h as it should. So there is a choice of the gamma mu's that ensures that this thing goes back to the Boltzmann distribution. So at least this limit is included in this expression. Now, how to compute with this distribution the S mu squared, for example, or the P mu squared average over this distribution? Well, this is not obvious because the I mu's are quartic functions of the S's and the P's, and hence it's not just Gaussian integrals as it was for the Boltzmann distribution of the problem. So here we have to make an average over a measure which is non-quadratic. So how do we do that? Well, one thing that we can do is that since we know that in the long run z of t goes to a constant in time, when we do the dynamics, this we saw, a plausible guess for these averages in the n going to infinity limit, taken before the time goes to infinity limit, is that these averages will be given by harmonic averages, but with temperatures that will depend on the mode that you look at. So this is like harmonic oscillators, as we had for the Boltzmann distribution at the beginning, only that the temperature is not fixed. We have no temperature in this problem. So let's propose that there is a temperature for each mode, that of course, if I'm assuming harmonic statistics for the modes of the problem, the temperature that appears in the average of the p square should be the same as the one that it appears in the average of the position. I also have the spherical constraint to fix the z, and the mode temperatures, which I don't know a priori, should be fixed by the condition that the average of the constants of motion over this measure should be the same as the average of the constants of motion over the initial conditions. So if I impose this. The left-hand side, I know it already. I told you that I can compute it with the Boltzmann initial distribution. The right-hand side, I can express using these forms as, again, some integral form in which the spectrum of mode temperatures appears. So now here I have either n equations that fix the n t mu's, or an integral equation, functional integral equation, that should fix the t of lambda, thought about it as in the continuum limit, valid in the n going to infinity limit. Now, if I have a condensation in the initial condition, I have to separate the case in and consider a different equation. I didn't write it, we have it, and then we have, you know, sets of equations that can be solved numerically. So this is an ansatz that allows us to circumvent computing the averages with this quartic measure. Actually, one can check that this ansatz is consistent with the quartic measure that we have there, because we can also do some kind of saddle point evaluation, although the action, the measure is quartic, can be dealt with the Haber-Sartone decouplings and, you know, again, techniques of disorder systems and some smart passages to the continuum, taking n going to infinity limits and so on and so forth. So this ansatz is indeed consistent with this measure, and this can be shown again analytically, but okay, it's a little bit technical to show here. So now, how does the dynamics compare to the GGE averages? So for example, here I'm showing you plots where there is the averages, both dynamical in time and with the GGE of the modes p squared, of the momenta squared of each of the modes, and the position squared of each of the modes. And here they are curves, as you see, with the GGE done for finite n, the GGE in the limit of n going to infinity, which can be done analytically, and solving these equations that I showed you there. The dynamics for small n, the dynamics for large n. And you see that, well, okay, the agreement between all these four curves is very good, and similar coincidence can be found in sectors 2 and 3 of the phase diagram. There's a little catch in sector 4, which I don't have time to discuss, but it's related to these ideas of fluctuation catastrophes of Katz, Thomson, and Zanetti. But okay, we understand what's going on there as well. And as I said, the harmonic ansatz is confirmed by the saddle point evaluation of the GG. So what have we done? Let me summarize what I said. So what we've done is to exhibit, we have exhibited a classical non-trivial integrable model. The quench dynamics can be solved in different ways. So it can be solved on average over the disorder with Schwinger Dyson kind of equations, can be solved directly in the mode representation, and just run the dynamics and see how the modes evolve in time and compute averages over them. So that's the dynamical calculation. On the other hand, we also managed to calculate, mostly analytically. Again, there's always some numerics to do at the end with these integral equations that we couldn't manage to solve analytically, but still, I mean, it's mostly analytical calculation, in which we managed to compute the averages over the GGEs of the mode observables. And we showed, again, numerically, that these asymptotic dynamics and GGE averages coincide for n going to infinity within numerical accuracy, of course. So, as I already said, I mean, this is nice because it's, well, maybe the first, I'm not sure if it's the first or not, but certainly one of the first at least, classical problems that can be solved completely, and it's you know, integrable and everything can be computed and the GGE can be exactly evaluated and the map between the two results checked. So this is satisfactory. It's also, I think, for some of the quantum people, a good measure, I mean, a message, because sometimes they tend to claim that there are specialties of quantumness that are not so much related to the quantumness of the problems, but more to the isolation of the problems from the environments. So, okay, I think it's nice to show this. Now, what next? What can be done? Something we would like to do now is to treat the spherical ferromagnet, one could say, okay, everything I told you can be naively and directly extended to the spherical ferromagnet and then have some control on real space properties of a problem. There may be, I'm not sure, we are thinking about it, problems with the degeneracy of the eigenvalues. I mean, in the problem with the Gaussian interactions, we are sure that there are no two eigenvalues which are identical because of the level repulsion. In the finite dimensional spherical ferromagnet, this is not true. And well, okay, I don't know if this is a real problem or not. So we're looking at this problem and want to see what happens with the aim of having some way to check the special structure of the constants of motion. Something that worries the quantum people very much. So, okay, my problem here is non-local at all at the beginning, from the start. Then it becomes a little bit local when one sets it in terms of the modes, although there is a coupling through the Lagrange multiplier. Okay, we want to have some problem with local spatial structure to see what happens, but I cannot tell you more about that. I can also tell you that there are some other groups who are working on similar ideas. So Herbert Spohn has studied toda lattices, also Gradenigo, Vulpiani, and Baldovin very recently sent a preprint to the archive where they looked at the same problem. I had looked at the low-dimensional classical scalar field theory with Alvise Bastianello, Alessio Chiocchetta and Andrea recently, and now we are looking with Paolo Politi and Fabio Staniscia at a similar problem with long-range interactions. Okay, these are not necessarily integrable problems, but okay, there are things which resemble. Anyway, we look at evolution of isolated classical systems and try to understand how they evolve in time and what happens in the long time limit. So these are the sort of things that I've been thinking about in this context, and I thank you for the attention.
So thank you, Leticia, for the very interesting talk. Now we have some time for some questions. So if someone has a question, can ask directly to Leticia. Okay, I see that Stefano Ruffo has a question.
Hello, Leticia.
Ciao, Stefano.
Ciao. So, sort of philosophical question. So when you say everything can be computed, in fact, you compute something which is related to modes or to other features of the model. But of course, I don't expect that the system is ergodic, no? So, so in some sense, it should be a class of observables that are computable and obey this generalized Gibbs ensemble measure. And what can you say about this class of observables that, how large it is, and I mean, what type of what you expect from this observable to be?
Well, this, let me show you this. Okay. This Emile Yushbashian, he argued that actually the microcanonical generalized Gibbs ensemble measure is ensured for these problems. For classical problems with n constants of motion, you just have to put, fix the value of each of these constants of motion, and then the system will be ergodic in this microcanonical sense, so that the full, the surface of the phase space covered by these constants, constrained by these constants, will be covered by the Newton evolution of this problem. And so this measure will, this measure will describe the isolated evolution of the problem. Now, if you want to build a canonical measure from this microcanonical one, then for that the problem I was looking at, you enter into the problems that you know very well. So you need to claim additivity, well, of the energy, but not now only of the energy. If you go the same routes that you developed, you have to add the assumption of additivity of all these constants of motion. And then you also have to extend the extensivity of the energy to the extensivity of each of these constants of motion. But then I run into trouble with the extensivity of my sum in the partition sum, because in the exponential factor, because I have a sum over n objects, which all should be order n. So I cannot derive with your methods the canonical measure from the microcanonical one for these kind of systems, right? So, but maybe, you know, okay, let's accept that this way of deriving the GGE in the canonical form is not possible for these problems, but maybe still, I mean, there are combinations of these that allow you to, I mean, as for our case, no, the I-mu's are not all order n. There's only one, which is order n in some case. They're all otherwise order 1, but this sum becomes order n, so everything, you know, arranges in a different way. So I would say that for our problem, all these local in mode space degrees of freedom, all the ones that one can compute, are computable on average with this measure. What else can one imagine? I don't know. I mean, there's nothing else, no, in this problem. So, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, it's a very large class of observables that you can claim can be computed using this measure. Yes.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, then I see that Roberto has a question.
Thank you. Very shortly, Leticia,
Yes.
you just mentioned that you just bypassed the question of the relation of all that stuff with the quantum description. In which sense all that is relevant? In which sense all what you described to us is of some relevance for quantum problems? It's not just a direct transfer.
Well, okay. On the one hand, this problem, the same model, can be made quantum. So, you know, in principle, one could try to study it, you know, in its quantum version and see what happens. We haven't done it, but for a small number of degrees of freedom, people have done it in the past. So have looked at this problem for n equals 3, 4, or something like this in the quantum version. Now, I think that, you know, conceptually, one has to distinguish which peculiarities of these systems are linked to the quantumness and which ones are linked to the isolation. I heard many people say, no, GG is quantum. No, GG is not quantum. GG is, you know, you can build them equally well in classical systems. It's only that historically, there was this revival of issues concerning equilibration in the quantum realm, and the problems were not treated in the classical systems in parallel. So, you know, but GGEs can be built classically if you're lucky to know the constants of motion, and then the same questions can be asked. Of course, there is all the technology of Bethe ansatz and all these things that are you know, heavily used in the quantum systems that help them study finite dimensional problems, and well, they have lots of results, of course. But I think that some of the issues they find are just related to the isolation, not to the quantumness.
Yeah, so in some sense, you are just trying to transfer the message that the conceptual frame is clear already in the classical framework, and then you can be confident that upon some technicalities or other adaptations concerning also the problem that was raising Stefano before, you can transfer them with successfully to the quantum description.
Exactly, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
This is your main message, I guess.
That's right, yes. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so if there are no more questions, I think we can thank again the Leticia for the very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Grazie.
Ciao Letizia.
Ciao Raf, ciao. Adesso ti vedo.
Ciao.
A presto, grazie.
Ciao Stefano.
A tutti.
Ciao.
Grazie ancora Letizia, grazie ancora.
No, grazie a voi.
Ciao.
Ciao Letizia, grazie.
Ciao Lucilla.
Ciao Lucilla.